and welcome to the Divorce Lab. We're a group of independent professionals working to help educate the public on various topics related to divorce. I am Carri Goldring, a certified divorce lending professional who specializes in mortgage planning.
And I'm Mark Avezai. I'm a certified divorce financial analyst. I work primarily in Troy, Michigan.
Hi, I'm Jim Chryssikos. I'm a family law attorney and mediator located in Troy, Michigan. So let's get started with today's show.
Hi, Jim. How are you?
Good, Carri. How are you?
I am well. Well, I guess it's just the two of us today. And
Okay.
I thought we could talk to our audience about appraisal values of homes, because I know sometimes it's a little confusing between the appraisal that you would do when you're working out the divorce settlement agreement or judgment and the appraisal that I would do regarding the mortgage. So can you start and explain, when you're determining the value of real estate owned, what goes into figuring that out and getting an appraiser and timing and all that other fun stuff?
Sure. Well, when I have a client and a couple owns a home together, the first question is, how do we want to put a value on their home? And sometimes people just agree, this is the value of the home. Maybe they already have discussed it and agreed on a value. Maybe they just bought the home. Maybe they've already obtained an appraisal before they hired me. But generally, if they don't have an agreement yet, or we're not sure if they have an agreement, then we'll talk about a few options. Number one is, first of all, is somebody keeping the home, or have the parties agreed? Is it likely they're going to end up selling it? And if it turns out that they've agreed tentatively that neither is going to keep the home, and it's likely going to be listed for sale, then we don't go through any trouble of having it appraised, obviously, because the market will tell us what it's worth when it sells. Of course, if one of them would like to keep it, or both of them, then my recommendation would typically be, let's get an appraisal. Sometimes people don't want to spend the money for an appraisal. An appraisal of a home usually is going to be in the neighborhood of around $500, give or take. It depends on the value of the home, the size of the home, et cetera. But generally speaking, right around $500. And if a person says, oh, I'm not really willing to spend that yet, then maybe what they'll do is they'll go frequently to Zillow, will be their first stop, or some online resource, which is completely unreliable for purposes of valuing a home in a divorce case. But if they just want to get a general idea, or if I do, sure, we can go on Zillow just to get an idea. But to get something that's reliable, something that I can rely on, something that a mediator or a judge can rely on, we need to retain an appraiser who is a certified real estate appraiser who will go in there. They'll actually inspect the property, not just go online and check out what's the square footage or what are comparable sales, things that you can do on Zillow, for example, that many of us do. But they'll actually go and look at it. They'll note things that need repair. They'll note things that have been updated. They'll note things that don't show up necessarily if you look on Zillow. So they're doing a pretty thorough job, and they have very strict licensing requirements, et cetera, as you well know. And so that would be the first step. And sometimes that can be our own appraisal that we just hold, say, this is our appraiser, our appraisal, and we can provide it to the other side at the appropriate time. Or sometimes the couple agrees, let's just go 50-50 on one appraiser, and I'll pay half, you pay half, and we'll get a neutral appraisal, which is good. Because when there's a neutral appraisal, there's the tendency that both parties will accept that value. Not always. Sometimes one person accepts it and the other doesn't. Sometimes neither accept it, which is, now we're looking at getting 3 appraisals in total. But usually if a couple agrees they're going to use a neutral person, then they'll generally speaking go along with that value.
Okay, got lots of questions.
Yeah.
Hopefully from the perspective of the listeners.
Sure.
The date of the appraisal, because we know a divorce could take months and months and months.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And we know the real estate market is always fluctuating, right? Yep. So how do you handle the date that the appraisal is done? Because I know you need a value for negotiating of how things work. versus does it even matter at that point if 5, 6, 7 months down the road, the market's different?
My answer to that would be, in most cases, that's not a problem, because in most cases, we're going to get an appraisal somewhere around the middle of the case, after there's been an exchange of information, after we've filed all the appropriate documents with the court, the answer to the complaint, and so on. And then from the date the appraisal is actually done to the date that most cases get settled, if they get settled, most cases do get settled, obviously the vast majority. It's usually not that long of a lag time. You know, maybe it's 2 months stale, maybe it's even 3 months stale. But I think most people are willing to live with that because, you know, it's not that long of a delay, unless something's really changed dramatically with the market. Okay.
Okay.
But short of that, it's rarely an issue. And if it ever really was an issue, and let's say they had a neutral appraisal, but then we're sitting down to settle the case and one of the parties is saying, I don't think that value is legit anymore, we need to look at it again. I think it would then be a fairly easy matter of calling up the appraiser and saying, you did this appraisal 3 or 4 months ago. You don't need to go and look at it again because nothing's changed. What you
Right.
may need to do is look at updated comparable sales in the neighborhood and see if an update is warranted. Up or down, you know, could be an increase or decrease in value based on market activity. So I
Right.
think most appraisers would be willing to do that for little or no charge. Say, yep, I'll just look at updated comparable sales. I'll update my report and we'll go from there.
And do you even know what their requirements are when they, I mean, I know what requirements are when we need to sell a mortgage in the secondary market. They're pretty strict.
Mhm.
Are there strict guidelines for doing a divorce appraisal, or you just assume the appraiser knows what they're doing and all things are pretty much equal from one appraiser to the next? Are there guidelines? How does that work?
Yeah, well, there's definitely licensure requirements for appraisers. There's regulations involving real estate appraisers. Every appraisal report you get, the last page is usually their certificate of licensure. So they definitely have guidelines that they're required to follow. What those specific guidelines are, I couldn't recite to you because I'm not an appraiser, but they do have rules and guidelines that they're required to follow.
Okay.
And you know, aside from those, there are just sort of standard practice types of things like I mentioned, comparables. You know, you're going to look at an appraisal report and you're going to see comparable sales in the neighborhood, and you generally want to see as close to comparables as you can find. So, you know, I've had cases where I get an appraisal and all the comps are either very old sales, months old, or not in their neighborhood. And so it is important for an attorney to actually look at the appraisal report from an expert or an opposing expert and make sure that it makes sense. And you know, sometimes people just take for granted that, well, if an appraiser said it, it's true. And more times than not, that's the case. But sometimes you look at something and you say, why isn't there any comparable listed here that has sold within the last 4 or 5 months?
Right. It gets
There must
very
be,
tricky.
yeah, there must be more recent comparable sales that we can look at. And then if you really want to get into it, you know, you can look at, make sure that the comparable sales listed are in fact comparable, like square footage, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, the neighborhood, et cetera. So it should never be, you get the appraisal and then it's just rubber stamped. Yep, that's the value. We all agree. I mean, you do have to look at them with a critical eye. And rarely do I have a beef with an appraisal that comes in, especially since I have a relatively small pool of appraisers that I recommend to my clients.
And they
But
know it.
yeah, sometimes you do see something that a red flag pops up, and at least you need to ask the question, if not, update the appraisal.
And then you mentioned repairs.
Yeah.
Are those repairs that would be needed for safety, or repairs that they think you need if you put the house up for sale, or what
They're
about
just
the repairs?
they're just repairs that impact the value. You
Okay.
know,
Like
I've
someone had a
seen,
hole in the wall.
yeah, like, yeah, there's loose shingles on the roof, or the siding is damaged. Somebody was, a tree must have fallen on it or something. And,
Okay,
they'll just note things that affect the value, obviously. And usually you can see them in photographs in the report. But yeah, we're not talking about things that necessarily have to be repaired. Just this is an issue. It's affecting the value. If the couple wants to make the repair, they certainly can. And maybe if they were selling it, they would definitely want to make the repair. But, we're selling the home as is to one of the spouses. That's the goal here of getting an appraisal. We're not selling a home in perfect condition. We're selling the home in its current condition. And if there are repairs needed, it's going to be noted in the report.
right. And you mentioned Zillow is a lot of, the first run.
Yeah.
Is Zillow accepted by a judge if both people agree?
No, it's not that Zillow is going to be accepted by a judge. It's just that the parties are agreeing that the value is X.
Okay,
And we don't necessarily indicate where that value came from. Could come from Zillow, could come from some other website, could come from a tax document, the state equalized value. I mean, before there was Zillow, there was the SEV, the state equalized
right.
value. People would zero in on that SEV and double it, and that was your estimate of your home value. Not necessarily, but that's what
That
people
was a good
thought,
rule
at
of
least.
thumb.
That's like a rule of thumb, right? And
It's as good as Zillow.
we don't have to put what the basis was to come to a value. If you agree on a value, you agree on a value, and we'll just put that in there, and that makes life very easy. But people often don't agree on the value when one person's keeping it.
Right, right. That makes sense. And I know it gets really interesting when someone's keeping the home. Most of the time, they need to get their own mortgage to take a spouse off a mortgage or to get some of that marital equity out of the house to give to the other party.
Mhm.
Not always, but most of the time, we as a mortgage company require an appraisal.
Mhm.
So I've had on some small occasions, because if you're refinancing and you're still married, the soon-to-be ex-spouse does have a couple pieces of paper they have to sign because they still are married, so they have this homestead right to know what's going on in their current home. And
Mhm.
then they'll see our appraised value.
Mhm.
Now, if it comes in lower than what they agreed to, no one says a word, right? But if it comes in higher, then a lot of times I get the phone call, we need to redo numbers, or this isn't fair,
Mhm.
or what happens.
Yeah, if they didn't do an appraisal in the first place, then that's just the risk you take, I would say. That
Right.
you
I
could
would,
be entitled to more or less than the value you agreed upon. Okay.
right. It's a
So it
changing
shouldn't be
number.
so it shouldn't be a surprise if they passed on doing an appraisal um, to settle the case, that when the bank does the appraisal for the mortgage, it's higher or lower than what they anticipated. That's just, goes without saying. But if they did do an appraisal and that they paid for in context of settling the divorce case, and then the bank appraisal for the mortgage comes in higher or lower, I suppose I would have a similar answer, that should not be that surprising. That you could get 100 appraisals on a piece of property, and you might theoretically get 100 different values.
I think you
Um,
would.
yeah, and so that shouldn't come as a surprise. I think what we're going to be focused on, if that were to happen, or when it happens, is what's the extent of the discrepancy? Is it significant? How significant is it? Is it something that we can look at the two appraisals and sort of identify why is one coming out so different than the other? With the average household, it's probably not that significant. And it's maybe something that they'll either say, it's fine, I don't want to incur more attorney fees and fight about it. It's not worth it. It's not worth the dispute. The amount in dispute is worth less than what I would spend to fight about it, right? That's the hope.
Right.
But if it's significant, I mean, if you're talking about a really valuable home where it's a sizable difference, then the question is, well, what did we rely on when we settled the case? And is that a basis to go back and modify that settlement or overturn that settlement? Most cases, no. Especially if you had a joint or neutral appraisal, and everybody had an opportunity to look at it. And just because a bank appraiser comes up with a different value later, it doesn't necessarily mean somebody can open up the settlement and take another look at it. Again, unless there was something really wrong, like there was a mistake made in the original appraisal, or if it turned out that the appraiser who did the one that we all relied upon was like the brother-in-law or best friend, and somehow it slipped our attention, some kind of fraud, in other words. But generally speaking,
That doesn't happen.
you enter a settlement, it may not be perfect. It's based on the information that we have available when we sign the settlement. And it shouldn't be too surprising that something turns out to be a little different down the road. And who's to say which one is right? The first appraisal or the second? So
right. And our appraisals for mortgage purposes are more for us, right? The person lending the money, to make sure that we lend a certain percentage of what the home is worth, and we do our underwriting according to that. We're not doing an appraisal from the eyes of this is your house's worth for you to split equity.
And in my experience, at least what I've been told, and you may disagree with this, I'd be interested if you do, is that bank appraisals for purposes of a mortgage tend to be more conservative in terms of the value, because they don't want to overextend themselves. Banks don't want to overextend themselves when they're giving out mortgages. They're going to be a little conservative on the value, pardon me, when they're approving a mortgage. Do you feel that way, or do you think that's incorrect?
A bank?
Like if somebody's going to Chase Bank and getting a mortgage from Chase Bank to buy out their spouse.
Maybe a mortgage company, I would say probably not true. So our appraisers, just like you, right? They're regulated, they're licensed, probably the same appraisers. And they have very, very strict rules depending on where the mortgage is going to end up when we sell the loan. So conventional mortgage, Fannie, Freddie have their own set of rules. FHA has their own set of rules. VA has their own set of rules. So depending on what type of mortgage they're doing, the appraisal could vary because the underwriting guidelines are different.
Okay. Interesting.
But I would say some of the very basic rules of what they're supposed to find, if humanly possible, is a house that is sold that's comparable. So, ranches to ranches, unique homes to unique homes, lakefront to lakefront. They have to be somewhat comparable. They have to make adjustments to the value of the subject based on what's added or missing from the homes they're comparing to. So if someone has an extra garage or a fireplace, they're adding or subtracting from the value. So it's not your house sold for 200 and mine sold for 210, so it's worth 205. There's some adjustments in there. So it has to sell within the last 3 months. Has to be in the same school district. You can't cross any major roads.
Okay.
Then there might be, I'm sure there's a ton of other things, but those are the main ones that I know off the top of my head to determine a value. Now, if they can't find something that's sold within 3 months or a like home, they can extend their circle.
Sure.
And then they have to give an explanation as to why they're extending the circle. So FHA makes them pay attention to some safety features in the home and delayed maintenance. So
what is delayed maintenance?
So let's say there's paint that's scraped on the side of the house and you see the paint flakes, they'll make them repaint. Where a conventional loan would not care. If you have 3 steps, the government, which is more FHA loan, would say you need a handrail. Conventional wouldn't care. If there's no GFI switches near water, they're going to have. So those kind of things are going to get brought up more on FHA than a conventional. And then if they're doing a VA type mortgage, the Veterans Administration actually does their own appraisal. So they're a little more strict and timely, so they take more time. So those come in even a little bit different. So there's some interest to that.
Because you
Um,
think of those things in the context of if I'm selling a home and an inspector is coming in and saying, hey, you got to do A, B, and C to bring this house up to code before we can close. But you're saying even for a refi, depending on the lender, they might require some of these things, which I've not heard before.
yeah, I just recently needed somebody to scrape and paint their garage on a
Interesting.
refi. And it's hard to find someone to come scrape and paint a garage. That's a little job to have to find someone to do. So, and that was FHA. So that gets a little bit tough. So yeah, so it is interesting that that comes up. And that's why when you put a house up for sale, it says in there, what type of financing are you going to accept? So you're either going to say cash, conventional, FHA, and that kind of relates to what type of appraisal are you going to be willing to accept, and what do you understand when you get this appraisal? So like an inspector who might go on a roof, the appraiser looks at the roof from the sidewalk. So if they see buckling shingles or curved shingles, they'll comment on it, but no one's going on the roof. They'll stick their head in the attic, but no one's crawling through the attic. So they're even a little bit different. So what I have seen sometimes, you have to let me know what you think about this. Someone is going to stay in the house. They know they're going to need to get a mortgage. They prefer not to pay for 2 appraisals. So on some occasions, we can get the 2 parties to agree that the equity owed to the spouse is a formula. So whatever the appraised value from said mortgage company minus the payoff letter used to pay off the mortgage divided by 2 is what the equity is going to be.
See, I wouldn't do that.
Okay, why?
Or I can tell you that I feel like I could probably successfully challenge that and get that settlement thrown out. Because
Okay,
when you're doing something like that, what you're essentially doing is you're saying that we're not going to resolve the value of the home. We're going to let this appraiser establish the value of the home. And we don't know what their answer is going to be. So that's more similar to, we're going to make this appraiser a binding arbitrator in terms of the value of our home. And a real estate appraiser cannot be a binding arbitrator. An arbitrator has to be an attorney. So I think I can understand why somebody would want to do that, because we don't want to spend more money than we need to, but I think it's inviting trouble if somebody is really unhappy with that outcome.
right.
And I think if I were representing the person unhappy with that outcome, I think I would be able to get that thrown out. And so then you're spending way more than the cost of 2 appraisals.
Right.
You're spending, thousands instead of, 500 on an appraisal.
So maybe more for a collaborative type of divorce or mediated divorce.
Or the parties just agree on a number, and I know that's not easy. It's easier said than done, right? The value of what the party keeping the home will pay the other party who's not keeping the home. But,
right.
But then at least then you're not tying it to something that's unknown. See, either the parties have to agree on the value of the home, or an arbitrator or a judge have to decide the value of the home. But it can't be, we're going to go with the appraisal, because you can't just give that kind of power to an appraiser, even though they know more than anybody else, probably. Somebody does have that right. The only thing you would maybe consider doing to that, which would make it a little less likely that somebody would object to it or fight it, is you could say, if it comes out within this range, fine. If it doesn't come within this range and party B, let's say, disagrees with it, or either party disagrees with it for that matter, then the parties will obtain a second appraisal appointed by, say the mediator or arbitrator or somebody. But even then, I think you're just giving too much power to an appraiser, too much authority to an appraiser who doesn't have that authority under the law.
Right. And then from my little mortgage non-law head,
Yeah.
these 2 people come up with a value, then I go get an appraiser. I
Mhm.
have to use the value that the appraiser gives from the mortgage perspective. And then I'm subject to, depending on what type of mortgage they're doing, how much equity they have to retain in the home. And is there enough equity there to pay off the current mortgage? And is there enough equity there to give the other spouse what they're supposed to walk away with?
Mhm.
Or can I not even do what was agreed upon because I don't have the value there? But I guess that's just got to come up with another plan B, right? If that happens.
Yeah, you're in a different arena altogether. One is in the divorce litigation
Mhm.
under the court rules, under the, Michigan statutes, and one is a regulated industry requirement like mortgages, banking, et cetera. And
Right.
those two aren't going to necessarily be the same, obviously. So that's interesting because you're getting the legal perspective and then the mortgage perspective. And
Right. So if you do it pre-divorce and
Mhm.
there's a mortgage issue, then maybe it's easier to solve on the divorce side than if you get the divorce first and then you have to do the mortgage and then you find out, whoops, can't do what the divorce decree
Well,
says.
the risk you run with doing it before pre-divorce, you mean during the divorce case or before filing for divorce?
Doesn't matter.
Okay. The risk you run is that nothing is final. We can agree to something. We can agree to take a certain course of action. We can agree to get an appraisal. We can agree on a value, but none of that's binding in terms of the property settlement in the divorce case until the couple actually puts it in writing, signs it, goes in front of a judge, gets it, So people can do what they want to do before there's a divorce, and they can act in good faith and negotiate in good faith and hope that they both are going to comply with what their agreement was. But
Mhm.
it's not unusual that they'll have different perceptions of what the agreement was, or something changes. Like,
Right.
like the value came out way different than I was expecting. And then they go talk to an attorney and the attorney says, well, you didn't commit. You're not obligated to do what you two talked about. There's no
Right.
settlement in place. There's no judgment of divorce that says you have to do that. So,
Right.
you
And that
always,
gets very tricky, right? Because then I'd be the one
yeah,
who'd go, I can't loan you that much money,
yeah,
even though your divorce decree says it, because
yeah.
you don't have the equity. So you kind of go back and forth, which is why we always like to look at things from all different angles, right?
Mhm.
Because we don't know, we conflict. We often conflict
Yeah.
in our rules.
And there are pre-filing options to get a settlement in place. So if you don't want to have to go through a long litigated divorce case, as I've talked about here, many times, we've got
Mhm.
collaborative divorce, which we can work out before filing. We've got pre-filing mediation, which are early stage mediation, which I do.
Right.
And people can sit down and they can work out all these issues and sign an agreement before filing, so you don't have to wait out a lengthy litigation process. And then it is binding because generally speaking, they will have had the either assistance of legal representation or the opportunity to consult with an attorney at least. And they'll have a signed settlement agreement to rely on even before the divorce case is filed. So
Right. I guess
those are
those
all
are some,
possibilities that they can do. And I know for your purposes, a lot of times that's helpful because that can start, if somebody needs to start showing income support, that can be put in place early before even filing for divorce. And so by the time the divorce case is winding down, they'll have had the requisite number of support payments to use it to apply for a mortgage.
right. It really just goes to show how everybody is so unique, right? And every situation is
Yeah.
unique, and depending on what's going on, some things are better than others, right?
Yep. Yep.
That's very true. All right. Anything else that we should add before we
Well,
wrap?
I think we've covered it pretty well, and I hope people find this useful.
I do too. I do too. All right. Well, then I'm going to sign off. And if anyone would like to go to our website, which is divorce-lab.com, and bring up any suggested topics that you would like to have, we'd be more than happy to do those.
Thank you for listening to us today. You can find us on the divorcelab.com. You can feel free to take a look at our other episodes, and you can also leave some questions or comments for us on there as well.